satire that juggles with the stars and kicks the world about like a football, it is necessary to be one's self temperate and even mild. A modern man like Nietzsche, a modern man like Gorky, a modern man like D'Annunzio could not possibly write real and riotous satire. They are themselves too much on the borderlands. They could not be a success as caricaturists, for they are already a great success as caricatures. I have mentioned his religious preference merely as an instance of this interior moderation. To say, as some have done, that he attacked nonconformity is quite a false way of putting it. It is clean across the whole trend of the man and his time to suppose that he could have felt bitterness against any theological body as a theological body. But anything like religious extravagance, whether Protestant or Catholic, moved him to an extravagance of satire, and he flung himself into the drunken energy of Dickens. He piled up to the stars the verbose flights of stairs of Mr. Chadband, exactly because his own conception of religion was the quiet and impersonal morning prayer. It is typical of him that he had a peculiar hatred for speeches at the graveside. An even clearer case of what I mean can be found in his political attitude. He seemed to some an almost anarchic satirist. He made equal fun of the system which reformers made war on, and of the instruments on which the reformers relied. He made no secret of his feelings that the average English Premier was an accidental ass. In two superb sentences he summed up and swept away the whole British Constitution. England for the last week has been in an awful state. Lord Coodle would go out, Sir Thomas Doodle wouldn't come in, and there being no people in England to speak of except Coodle and Doodle, the country has been without a government. He lumped all cabinets and all government offices together and made the same game of them all. He created his most staggering humbugs, his most adorable and incredible idiots, and set them on the highest thrones of our national system. To many moderate and progressive people such a satirist seemed to be insulting heaven and earth, ready to wreck society for some mad alternative, prepared to pull down St. Paul's and on its ruins erect a gory guillotine. Yet, as a matter of fact, this apparent wildness of his came from his being, if anything, a very moderate politician. It came not at all from fanaticism, but from a rather rational detachment. He had the sense to see that the British Constitution was not democracy, but the British Constitution. It was an artificial system, like any other, good in some ways, bad in others. His satire of it sounded wild to those who worshipped it, but his satire of it arose not from his having any wild enthusiasm against it, but simply from his not having, like every one else, a wild enthusiasm for it. Alone, as far as I know, among all the great Englishmen of that age, he realized the thing that Frenchmen and Irishmen understand. I mean the fact that popular government is one thing and representative government is another. He realized that representative government has many minor disadvantages, one of them being that it is never representative. He speaks of his hope to have made every man in England feel something of the contempt for the House of Commons that I have. He says also these two things, both of which are wonderfully penetrating as coming from a good Radical in 1855, for they contain a perfect statement of the peril in which we now stand, and which may, if it please God, sting us into avoiding the long vista at the end of which one sees so closely the dignity and the decay of Venice. I am hourly strengthened, he says, in my old belief that our political aristocracy and our tuft hunting are the death of England. In all this business I don't see a gleam of hope. As to the populist spirit, it has come to be so entirely separated from the Parliament and the Government, and so perfectly apathetic about them both, that I seriously think it is a most portentous sign. And he says also this: I really am serious in thinking and I have given as painful consideration to the subject as a man with children to live and suffer after him can possibly give it, that representative government is become altogether a failure with us, that the English gentilities and subserviences render the people more unfit for it, and the whole thing has broken down since the great 17th century time, and has no hope in it. These are the words of a wise and perhaps melancholy man, but certainly not of an unduly excited one. It is worth noting, for instance, how much more directly Dickens goes to the point than Carlyle did, who noted many of the same evils. But Carlyle fancied that our modern English government was wordy and long-winded because it was democratic government. Dickens saw what is certainly the fact, that it is wordy and long-winded because it is an aristocratic government, the two most pleasant aristocratic qualities being a love of literature and an unconsciousness of time. But all this amounts to the same conclusion of the matter. Frantic figures like Dickens and Chadbrand were created out of the quietude of his religious preference. Wild creations like the Barnacles and the Bounderbys were produced in a kind of ecstasy of ordinary, of the obvious in political justice. His monsters were made out of his level and his moderation, as the old monsters were made out of the sea. Such was the man of genius we must try to imagine, violently emotional, yet with a good judgment, pugnacious, but only when he thought himself oppressed, prone to think himself oppressed, yet not cynical about human motives. He was a man remarkably hard to understand or to reanimate. He almost always had reasons for his action; his error was that he always expounded them. Sometimes his nerve snapped, and then he was mad. Unless it did so, he was quite unusually sane. Such a rough sketch at least must suffice us in order to summarize his later years. Those years were occupied, of course, in two main additions to his previous activities. The first was the series of public readings and lectures which he now began to give systematically. The second was his successive editorship of Household Words and of All the Year Round. He was of a type that enjoys every new function and opportunity. He had been so many things in his life, a reporter, an actor, a conjurer, a poet. As he had enjoyed them all, so he enjoyed being a lecturer and enjoyed being an editor. It is certain that his audiences, who sometimes stacked themselves so thick that they lay flat on the platform all round him, enjoyed his being a lecturer. It is not so certain that the sub-editors enjoyed his being an editor. But in both connections the main matter of importance is the effect on the permanent work of Dickens himself. The readings were important for this reason, that they fixed, as if by some public and pontifical pronouncement, what was Dickens's interpretation of Dickens's work. Such a knowledge is mere tradition, but it is very forcible. My own family has handed on to me, and I shall probably hand on to the next generation, a definite memory of how Dickens made his face suddenly like the face of an idiot in impersonating Mrs. Raddle's servant Betsy. This does serve one of the permanent purposes of tradition. It does make a little more difficult for any ingenious person to prove that Betsy was meant to be a brilliant satire on the over-cultivation of intellect. As for his relation to his two magazines, it is chiefly important, first for the admirable things which he wrote for the magazines themselves. One cannot forbear to mention the intimate monologue of the waiter in Somebody's Luggage. And secondly, for the fact that in his capacity of editor he made one valuable discovery. He discovered Wilkie Collins. Wilkie Collins was the one man of unmistakable genius who has a certain affinity with Dickens, an affinity in this respect, that they both combine in a curious way a modern and a cockney and even commonplace opinion about things, with huge elemental sympathy with strange oracles and spirits and old night. There were no two men in mid-Victorian England with their top hats and umbrellas more typical of its rationality and dull reform, and there were no two men who could touch them at a ghost story. No two men would have had more contempt for superstitions, and no two men could so create the superstitious thrill